Thank you, Almarie. I must say I was very surprised when one day I was in here and Almarie came to me and said, how do you feel about the fact interviewing Gwen? And I thought, oh my goodness, me? And she said, yes, you. So yeah, I sit and I'm very happy to be able to do this. I mean, I've known Gwen Lister, like many people know her, from the Namibian. I've seen her often, but I've never been introduced to her. I've never spoken to her personally. And today I sit here and I can do the interview. Wow! So thank you for agreeing.
Marianne.
And as you might have noticed, my voice sounds a bit funny. So like please excuse.
Exactly. Yeah. Imitating many years of cigarettes to get this.
Yeah, I wish. No, but anyway, I hope I will manage. Yeah, and then I had actually prepared some questions for Gwen, and we exchanged this also. And then, being a lecturer at UNAM, last night I realized I always think students come to class prepared. I always go out from that assumption, you know, that they would have read the book and everything. And so that's what I assumed as well, that everybody that comes to today, because the book has been on the market for so long, would have read it. And last night I realized, maybe if there are people that have not read it, so what do we do then? Can't start with my questions straight away. And so I want to start slightly differently than planned. And the first thing is, I want to ask you, when did you start writing the book?
Okay. Thank you, Marianne, very much for doing this interview with me. I'm not an academic, so I do hope I come up to scratch as far as that is concerned. And thanks also to Elmarie, Bruni and the team here at the Book Den for having us all, and obviously to our young people here who are doing the hard work for the live stream. And thank you all for coming. Some very familiar faces around here, happy to see faces I haven't seen in a long time. Quite honestly, you know, Amy was talking earlier and says, you know, people should set aside 6 months and sit down and write the book. Now, if I'd had the luxury of being able to do that, I think that would have been the best way to do it, but it didn't happen that way. And I must say, I think in the late 70s, I still found, while I was writing this book, typewritten chapters on an old manual typewriter where my fingers used to go through the keys and you need to change the ribbon and your fingers were inked all the time. I found a few chapters which I'd done in the early years when I started work on the Advertiser. So it's been done over a number of years, a couple of chapters here, a couple of chapters there. And then finally, in about a year and a half ago, I really sat down and I thought, I need to finish this book before, as Smitty always used to say, I pass off this mortal coil. He used to call it. So I thought, you know, if I die, and somebody actually said that to me, then someone else is going to do your book. And that spurred me into action. And I thought, okay, no, I don't want anyone else doing this, let me do it. And so again, taking time, mainly evenings, because I'm a person who's a bit of a night owl, so I work best at night and I'm most creative at night, and really started putting it all together. Okay. And I think the writing part was, I might be preempting your next question, but the writing part was the easiest part. The editing was the most difficult part, but I'm sure you will come to that.
Okay, so the next question would be, when did you come to then still SVR Namibia, I think it was called, and what made you come to Namibia, or then Southwest Africa?
Okay, well, as if most have read the book, they will have read that, you know, I had quite a history of activism in my late teen years at the University of Cape Town, and I made a decision at some point where I had what my daughter always called my aha moment, when I was a young schoolgirl, about 12, 13, on a bus in Cape Town. And in those days, many of you will remember, we had the double-decker bus with the whites downstairs and black people had to go upstairs. And a very elderly black woman got on the bus. I was sitting at the front, and I got up to offer her my seat. I was a young girl at Springfield Convent. And she took the seat, she had a couple of parcels and things, she sat down, and the rest of the bus, the white passengers, absolutely exploded with anger at the fact that I'd invited a black person to sit in the white part of the bus. And something in me literally, it had happened before that, but that was the moment it really triggered me to say, you know, something needs to be done about this curse that is apartheid. And I didn't know then what I would do or how I would do it, but I decided that whatever I do in life, it's got to be to take on that scourge, and as a so-called white person in those days, to do something about it. So that was really the time. And then after finishing university, my parents at the time were living in Sumet, and I thought, okay, maybe journalism is the way to go. And then at the South African newspapers, you had to, if you became a journalist, you had to work for a year. Okay. Doing what they called cub reporting, and you had to do the births and the deaths, and you had to be the copy person running from the editor and doing errands basically while learning the job. And I decided, no, I'm not, I need to get straight into the deep end. And so basically my parents saw that there was an advert in a local newspaper for a reporter, and that was on the Windhoek Advertiser. And so I applied for that job. I flew up for an interview, and I was interviewed by then Hannah Smith. Many of you will remember, some with fondness, some not. We did an interview, which was kind of an interview from hell, as the book also is quite descriptive about that first meeting. And then Jürgen Meinert, who was actually the owner of the Advertiser in those days, Smitty didn't want to appoint me, because he said, no, woman can't do journalism, I need a man. And Jürgen Meinert actually decided to appoint me, much against Smitty's wishes. And so I came up, and the reason I really came here was I thought, my aim is to fight apartheid. It really is probably the best way to do it, to come to the satellite of South Africa, known as then Southwest Africa, because if change comes, it's probably going to happen here sooner than it happens in South Africa itself. So that really was my rationale for
and
coming
when
here.
was that? When was it?
And that was in end of 1975, and I started work in 1976, January, on the Advertiser.
And was that still here in Tall Street?
That was in, no, it was Stubble Street.
Stubble, yeah,
Stubble.
sorry, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
Okay, good. And then, staying with the journalism part, you worked for the Advertiser for how many years then?
Well, it was basically for 2 years, because then change started to happen here. The group known as the Democratic Turnover Alliance came into being, and they wanted a mouthpiece, and so someone called Dieter Lauenstein at the time called the Advertiser and said, look, we need Gwen and Smitty just to be brought into line a little bit. They're a bit too negative about the DTA as it was then known, and we really would like to insist, because new money came into the paper, that they comply. And Smitty and I both decided we weren't prepared to do anyone's political bidding, and so we left in 1978. We both left the Advertiser, and I was devastated, because I thought, oh gosh, I've done all this, it's 2 years, I'm just getting my teeth into journalism, and now it's all over. And it wasn't a week later that Smitty came and knocked on my door and said, Gwen, I'm using my savings, we're starting another newspaper. And that is how the Windhoek Observer was born on the 4th of May, 1978.
That's right, yeah. And then you stayed with Smitty at the Windhoek Observer for the whole time?
For 6 years, until 1984, when a similar thing happened at the Windhoek Observer. And Smitty got a new business partner, who again, the paper had been banned on a few occasions. Mainly when I got back from Lusaka in 1984, there were the so-called Lusaka independence talks, which fell apart. And in my analysis of the event, I said that the talks to bring about a settlement in Namibia had failed, mainly because of South Africa's insistence on the linkage of Cuban troops in Angola with a settlement. And I said that, and the South Africans didn't like that, so they banned several editions of the Windhoek Observer, and then they banned the entire newspaper. And at the time I said to Smitty, let's appeal against the ban. And he said, no, let's let the Observer go, I'll register a new newspaper under a new name and we'll just start again. And I said, no, we need to get the Observer back. So he said, well, if you can do it, do it. and I managed to get funding from the US, and myself and then Brian Olin and Peter Cook went off to Pretoria to the Publications Appeal Board, and we appealed against the ban of the Observer. And we won. And the Observer was unbanned, although we were given a very strong warning that this left-wing politics had better stop, otherwise it really will happen for good. And I came back and I was delighted and said to Smitty, we won, we can carry on with the Observer, and I found a different Smitty. Because by then, I mean, there were hard times financially. He got the new partner on board, and the new partner basically said, you know, get rid of Lister. And so I was demoted, the staff all protested. They decided to walk out unless I was reinstated. I refused to, obviously, and walked out as well. And that was really it. And so I was back on the streets again and thinking, gosh, now this one has ended, what now? And at the time, I think Smitty admitted to me years later that he'd struck a deal with the then Administrator General Van Niekerk. Amy will also remember him. And basically said, if you get rid of Lister, then you will get advertising from the white business community for the paper. And that was really the, as Smitty said, he supped with the devil.
But he did admit it.
He did admit it finally, yes. And so then it took me about a year to start the Namibian.
And what did you do in the in-between time? Did you have any other means of income? Did you work for anybody else?
It was very tough. I was a single mother, no means of income, because all those who walked out of the Observer had been blacklisted by the business community, so nobody could get jobs. I was freelancing at the time for the BBC in the UK, for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and for a couple of radio stations in South Africa, which brought in a little bit of money, but not very much. The Anglican Bishop, Bishop James Kauluma, gave me basically a church house to stay in, because I was a single mother with a young son. And that's really how, I don't know really how I managed that year until the Namibian actually got started, but it was really some tough times for not only myself, but the staff who walked out. Don't you want a water, Marianne?
I think I should have another. And the Namibian was started then in?
The Namibian on August 30, 1985.
1985, yeah, it's been going ever since, no?
Still going today.
Yeah, very nice. Did it change somewhat in the meantime from when you started to now? Do you see that the way that you wanted it to be is still being the way it's driven?
Well, the main ethos behind the Namibian, which when we set it up in 1985, I did it with the assistance of my lawyer colleague, now a Judge, Dave Smuts. And we basically decided to set it up as a trust. So it was never and has never been a newspaper that's been owned by anyone. I know there are a lot of people in this town who still think Gwen owns the Namibian. Well, I wish I did, but it's always been a trust. And so all the money that is made by the newspaper, and as most of you know, times are tough for newspapers right now. There's not much in the way of profits or dividends. But right now, the profits that there are from the newspaper and from the printing press, which we also started in the interim, goes to the NMT Foundation, which in turn spreads the gospel of press freedom. And I do a lot of training of journalists and things like that. So there's nobody owns the Namibian, and we have no one breathing down our necks for profits. But the newspaper is, the ethos is a commitment to independent journalism and reporting, and I think they've managed to stay true to that to date. I'm not saying that as editors people do things differently and have different perceptions, and when I stepped down as editor and handed to Tangeni in 2011, he had to develop into a new era of journalism. I was a print person, so a bit of a dinosaur in that regard. And of course now came the digital era. And so he had to expand the newspaper into the new digital era. And, you know, sometimes people ask, would you have done it differently? Would you do it the same? I think probably slightly differently in some ways, but essentially the main thing is the newspaper has stayed true to its founding principles of independent ethical journalism.
That's great. Great to hear. Yeah, and I mean, it's been 10 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that first thing that struck me when I read about the author here at the end was that you had, and I quote, after a convent education. And that of course struck me because now looking around I can see a couple of the convent girls here. Having been one myself here in Windhoek.
Right.
The question arose, in how far did this Christian education that you got there influence and shape your resistance against inequality and for human rights?
Right. Well, I think it's a good question, Marianne, and I think, you know, along with a fairly liberal upbringing, such as it was in South Africa in those years, and attending convent most of the years that I was schooling, also a very liberal environment where we were taught to respect others, and you know, I don't say they went as far as I later went in life in trying to change things, but certainly they gave you the grounding as far as ethics and treating other people with decency and so on. I mean, I would think I was fortunate in that regard.
Okay, but you say you were not really the religious person, so...
Never. I mean, I had my flirtation with religion at a convent, I think as most young girls do have, and thought seriously about being a Catholic and becoming a nun one day, which fortunately something changed in the interim. But no, I think as the person I am today, I'm not typically a religious person in the traditional Christian sense or so on, and I think I've come to the conclusion over the years that life is about the way in which we live it, and as ethical sort of committed citizens who care about others and do the right thing. More than organized religion, which we all know from the apartheid era, how the church was abused to spread the gospel of apartheid. And I mean, Christianity has been used in many parts of the world in a very negative context. And I look at Namibia today, and we call ourselves a 95% Christian country, and I look at what's happening and I think that it's no more than lip service, and that it's not a real deep commitment to actual ethics and trying to change things and being good citizens and good to others.
Yeah,
so you know, that's the way I live my life at the moment, is trying to be good and do good for as long as I'm on this earth, and not to commit to any kind of organized religion for that matter.
I think the nuns will be very proud of you. Up there. Thank you. Well done, Gwen. No? You think so too? You write very early in your book, and I quote, "I was too committed to the peace movement to choose violence, even while I understood why many others felt the need for it," unquote. Did that stay your commitment even when you were heavily attacked yourself? And if that stayed your commitment, why?
Absolutely. I do recall, and again, I think there is mention of this in the book, that in my sort of late teen years, I had a colleague from school in Cape Town who made the decision to join Mkhonto weSizwe as a combatant. And I remember having long arguments with her about why she would choose that sort of path. And I thought about it, but then I realized I'm not that type of person, and I don't know, we never know really, do we, when presented with those kind of challenges, how you would react, but I'm not by nature a violent person. I was very influenced in my teen years by the hippie movement, and I always liked the slogan, "Make love, not war." I preferred that to the nastier side of life. And I thought, you know, it must be possible to try and change people, and to change people's perceptions about a system that is wrong. And there was something of a challenge, if you like, in that for me. Whether I actually succeeded, probably not, because I did have a lot of the whites in mind in all those years that I did journalism, hoping that people would think there is another way. We don't have to defend the system as it is. But you were dealing with a very deep level of propagandization, if that's the right phrase, of white people in general. Not all, there were always exceptions, but most people were totally invested or bought into the whole concept of Diswar Kafar and communism, and you know, our boys were just protecting us from the communist danger. And years later, many of those same people who defended, for example, the border war, changed their mind and realized they'd all been conned.
Yeah.
And I think that includes many of those who served in the SADF in very senior positions, as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa showed us.
Definitely, yeah. And when, for instance, the offices were attacked and started burning, etc., and you had to go to jail, it's all these things. Didn't you then feel this anger and wanted to also apply violence?
No, never. I must say I did get angry at times, and being a sort of stubborn person by nature, the more the forces came down upon me, the more I felt I was doing the right thing and convinced of that. Was I prepared to be a victim if that happened of violence, or be assassinated or killed in the course of? Yes, I was prepared for that, fully prepared. But I wasn't going to be the person to do that sort of thing. And I believed in the power of the pen and of trying to change things in that way. And I must say, I was very encouraged just last week, because you'll see on the back cover of the book is an inscription by a friend and colleague, Maria Ressa, who's in the Philippines, tackling the Duterte regime, which is draconian, and she's just been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize along with a Russian journalist. And so it's gratifying to know that, finally also journalists, and especially a woman journalist, is being acknowledged for the sort of change that she's bringing about in the world.
For those that don't have the book, it says, a woman, a journalist, a publisher. Gwen Lister's search for courage and justice in a cruel world is inspiring. Nice words.
Yeah, so it was sweet words. And then, as I say later, I would like it to be there on the cover, but it's not. She got the Nobel Peace Prize, so that was, it's wonderful. It's a sort of affirmation, if you like, for all of us, especially women who've been in journalism and taking on not such nice governments.
When I saw her name, I thought, rings a bell, but I didn't
make
put
the connection.
Thank you for that. When you came to Southwest Africa at the time to start your work at the Advertiser, you basically started a totally new life here in Windhoek. Without sharing common history with people here, and looking back, did that give you an advantage above us who grew up here in the apartheid era, who were known for being, the whites, etc.? And had also been assigned a certain position in society, and that's where you stay. Did you find you were advantaged, and because you also never had to defend your actions to people that were of a similar mindset than you had, whereas for us it was first trying to convince people that no, I actually do really mean this, I want this, etc. How do you see it?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I can fully answer it, but coming to Namibia fairly cold, so to speak, and not knowing people. I mean, obviously my parents were here at the time, but I'd merely come on visits to them, so it wasn't as though I'd formed friendships or associations with people in the country. I think was a certain advantage, because the minute I started with my reporting, and Smitty, who said, all right, if you want to do politics, I'm going to throw you into the deep end and send me off to SWAPO rallies in Katatura, where, I was the only white skin for miles, apart from the security police who sat in their cars a very safe distance away and monitored the situation. And so I was really thrown in the deep end. And I think that was an advantage, because I found that the black community in Namibia was the community that kind of embraced me. As soon as I became known for the kind of work I was doing and the journalism I was doing. And so I didn't come into the picture as a sort of white who'd grown up here for many years. So maybe you're right from that perspective. It might have been more difficult for me to sort of assert myself in my journalistic, but also in my personal role at the time.
Yeah, that I think is on the sort of like professional level, it's one thing.
Absolutely.
But also the private life, that you got accepted, rather be seen as a friend than for us. It took years, and in many cases it hasn't happened really that you have friendships, because you were always kept apart.
Exactly.
And you never shared this common, life, everyday life.
Yeah, I
etc.,
understand that, and I mean, I think it's a very good question. And also, it's not to say, I mean, especially in those early years, I didn't have some white friends.
Of course, yeah.
But the point was that I distanced myself from them quite a lot, because as I became more notorious, if that's the right word, they would be very much intimidated by the security police. And a lot of those people I was friendly with would be approached by the security police and told, be careful, don't be friends with that communist. And so they were a little intimidated, and I didn't want to compromise them or their lives, because politically speaking, they weren't necessarily on the same page as I was. And so I kind of began to withdraw from them, more to protect them than anything else.
Okay.
Yeah.
That particularly with the private life there, that struck me always when I was reading this thing.
Exactly.
And you were also mentioning in your book, and I quote again, you were exposed to the conservatism, prejudice and fears within the Afrikaner and the German farmer community.
Yeah.
Unquote. And I can fully understand that. I mean, we were just talking about this. But then how do you interpret the fact that quite a number, in particular German men, later joined SWAPO, came from this background?
Right.
Did you, what do you think drove them to do this?
Right. Well, I think, you know, along this life journey, I've learned a lot of things. And I mean, you're right. I mean, in those years, I would not have had access to that community, the farming community, had I not traveled with Smitty, who, as everybody probably knows him, would do what he called low flying, because he drove very fast and he always had a very good car. With his dog on his shoulder, and we would go all over the country and into some of these areas where Smitty, as an Afrikaner himself, was accepted, me less so, as an English speaker. But in that way I got exposed to their way of thinking and so on, which was obviously at the time very much in line with the official South African government approach, and those farms were heavily fortified, and you know, the terrorist threat was forever imminent. And so I saw that side of those communities. But in my life in journalism, I think, and that's one of the conclusions I come to later in the book, I mean, I was prejudiced against people like that back in the day. And I thought, those are people who want to kill me. Why would I like them? But obviously I've come to learn over the years, and that was exhibited by a lot of those, especially young German chaps who Heino Rumpf was one of them, and I wrote the stories about when they broke and often were alienated by their own families in taking the step they took to leave the country and go into exile and join SWAPO. Of course, one of the arguments is that those were mainly children from privileged and wealthy backgrounds who were able to leave the country. I mean, many other white kids who didn't want to serve in the SADF or be conscripted didn't have that choice because they didn't have wealthy parents and they couldn't not go. And so, as I say, so I wrote about those young men, and obviously in the greater scheme of things there were not as many of them as there could have been, but certainly there were those voices that spoke out fairly consistently against apartheid, and so, if you like, made for the point that we shouldn't discriminate against anyone, really, because we forget that also in the pre-independence days that Namibia, a lot of our young people today who don't know the history, think it was all these white people who wanted, you know, an internal government, and they didn't want SWAPO, and it wasn't true. There were a lot of black Namibians who were co-opted into the South African way of thinking. And a lot of them were tribal chiefs. A lot of them, I mean, the South Africans very successfully exploited tribal differences. And a lot of black Namibians went voluntarily into the so-called SWA territory force that we had back in the day. So it was never a simple situation of just white against black. And many of those people who were collaborators back in the day have obviously changed colour conveniently in the interim, and many of the exile community who came back don't know. A lot of those of us who were here through the years kind of know who was and who wasn't a collaborator, but the exile community didn't know. So when someone said, you know, we were struggling in Kibion, or we were struggling in Keetmanshoop, or wherever, and we went to our SWAPO rallies, and we fed and hid SWAPO insurgents. It probably wasn't the case. But anyway, that is part of our very complicated patchwork of Namibian history that many people think is a simple story, but it's not.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that particular, the history part is very important, because you call your book Comrade Editor, of course,
Right.
On life, journalism and the birth of Namibia. And with that, I mean, you've already indicated that it is about history. And you also write in your book, and I'll quote again, "It struck me anew that unless Namibia's history was properly told, they would never know the truth about some of the figures regarded as icons in the anti-colonial struggle." Unquote. As I carried on reading, and I did read the book from cover to cover, I didn't just scan it like some did, you know. So I really read it.
Naughty.
Yes, and you can see it with my scribbles in it. What I realized is this unfolding of the various people and the characters was actually not only making the book informative but fascinating. I found myself ever so often saying, "Oh yes, I completely forgotten about that thing, and this person, and yeah, he was there and there, and remember." And then all of a sudden these things came back, and yeah, history came alive. You know, it wasn't just dates and facts and figures, but people. And I think also the diversity of these people, you know, coming from Otavi, which was close to the central northern part. My parents had a shop selling everything from what a farmer could need on his farm, except grocery and clothes that we didn't have. And my father didn't comply with the Separate Amenities Act. He always said our shop had just one entrance.
Right. For everybody.
And the police came each year and said, "Herr Zappen, please, you must get a second entrance."
Yeah.
And he said, "When the people start paying in different money, I will get different entrance." And that carried on for years and years on end. And each year the police would come and visit, and then they were very happy when my parents built a new shop. And again, only one door, but yeah, it carried on. So quite a number of the people, of course, from the chiefs from the northern part, came to our shop because they were treated like everybody else. And my mother was in the fortunate position to be able to speak fluent Khoikhoi, Otjirero and Oshivambo.
Wow,
so
that's amazing.
They got that service. And I saw that some of the people that you mentioned, I remember them slightly different, you know, and then all of a sudden you see this person being developed into a character that I had not imagined.
Exactly.
And my question to you now is, because it's so fascinating and it becomes so alive in the book, won't you reconsider and actually take your personal part out of this book and have it as a history book that can be used in schools? Because this is history that really, it tells you how it's happening. It is fascinating to read, and also it will be for the young Namibians.
Right.
As you said earlier on, they don't know the history, and if they see this, they will understand much more, and it will become more valuable to them. You know, also how it developed, not just cut dates. You know, here's this date, there's that date. And
but you know, Marianne, it's interesting. Again, a good question, because when I was writing the book, I mean, a lot of people said to me, "We want to know what made you tick." Because really, I would have preferred to write a book about newspapering in Namibia through those decades of apartheid and into independence. I would have probably chosen to do that and left Gwen the person out of it, because that's what I've done all my life. My private life has been very much, in as much as I could, from the prying eyes of those who, you know, listened to your phone and watched your house and so on.
Exactly.
And then I decided to put it together, because since they were so insistent, they wanted to know what made me tick. So I said, okay, let me take those three strands, and the one is obviously Gwen the person, the second is Gwen the journalist and person who went through this media, whatever you call it, in Namibia, with starting several newspapers and continuing on, And then you couldn't do either of those without telling the story of Namibia and the birth of our country. And so it was a very complex book to write from that perspective. And as I was just telling Amy earlier, the original manuscript is double that size. It was 300,000 words. And when I started sort of sending it to publishers, they all completely blanched, and I was turned down. And I mean, they said, no ways we're going to publish such a long book. And I keep saying to Amy, I don't know how she got it right or how they got it right, that Turk Mudge's book is much longer than mine, and he got it published. But anyway,
not fair.
I obviously
I
went to the wrong, or something like that. But in the end, Tafelberg showed interest. But they said to me, look, we can't do 300,000 words. We don't do that anymore. And so they said to me, okay, you cut it down to 190,000. And so willy-nilly, I sort of take out vast chapters to get it to that length. And then they asked Rian de Villiers, who's an author himself in South Africa, to help me edit it back down to what they wanted, which was about 120,000. And Rian and I must have done it 3 times. It was a nightmare that I tell you, I would rather do everything awful I did in my life over again than do that editing, because it was literally like bleeding. So a lot of those issues that you talk about, I would have liked to go a lot deeper in the book. Even just the woman issue, just to take it a lot deeper into how it felt, what we did, and how it was to get through a lot of those things that happened to me in those years, but I couldn't. And Rian would keep sort of focusing me on, he said, look, they're the 3 threads and we need to keep it to that, and all these personal observations, and a lot of that had to, unfortunately, is on the cutting room floor. I will try and find a way in future to resuscitate or reconstitute them in another form, but I lost half of the book, essentially.
Okay.
And so to do a history book, I'm not an academic. I really never have been, Marianne. In fact, I'm just the opposite. And when somebody started to say to me things like footnotes, I said, no, don't even. My book will be accurate and honest, and I will verify everything, but I ain't doing footnotes and things. So somebody would certainly need to help me. But yes, I mean, you've got a point, and that is something that's been suggested. One of the people who read the book had actually said to me, who's a fairly prominent Namibian politician, said, can't this, as it is, go into the schools as a book? I don't know. Obviously, the personal side of things maybe makes it a bit more difficult to do that. But hopefully, I mean, Elmarie will know, more and more Namibians are writing books now. And so, I hope that a lot more, I mean, they're writing a lot of different books, but the struggle years itself is still not really written in what it deserves to be. The truth needs to be told. And we all know, obviously, of Sam Nyoma's book, Where Others Wavered, which when I read, I could hardly identify with because it was so sanitized in terms of the history of those struggle years. It had no meaning for me at all because I thought, that's not what I remember. So I hope that more and more people who were involved, and you know, this COVID era is taking a lot of the struggle stalwarts out at the moment, that how important it is, like Andimba Yatoiva, Hidipo Hamatenya were all writing, but then they died before their books could get published, so other people are still finishing them, and that's really sad. So I hope that in time we will get more people, perhaps, you know, contributing to that body of historical narrative around the coming into being of Namibia, so that we may have really, by putting them all together, the true story of what happened. Because the youth aren't to blame because they don't know what happened, because where are they going to find out? Because a lot of people are lying about our history as well. I mean, that is clear.
Yeah, no, I've got a course at university called German African Perspectives, looking at this. And I'm amazed with the ignorance that people come from school having had history, or having a view that you think, excuse me, you know, where did you learn this?
And sorry if I might add, Marianne, that's why I've sketched some, not all of the characters in history that I've had to do with in my reporting career. A lot of that got taken out because I went into a lot of detail for example, around the Turnhalle years.
Yeah, yeah.
Amy and others will remember that time, and some of the sort of leaders that came out of that era, internal leaders as they were known at the time, from the A.J. Kloppers, who was a school teacher from Kommerstal, which you think they would say, who the heck was he? But he deserves his little place in history, you know. And many others of them, and I talk about the Rurakos and others, maybe in a different way to what people now understand, because we, or I as a journalist, saw the Kapoors and the Rurakos as collaborators, largely speaking, and the Karinas, who today are lauded and have farms given to them and streets named after them. And so even from the exile perspective of what happened in Namibia, they are completely, if you like, I don't know, somehow, putting everything under wraps about what happened. It's kind of almost a forgive and forget, and reconciliation means that we really shouldn't tell our history truthfully. And that's not to say that I'm against them for doing that, because again, by the end of the book, I'd realized a lot of people did what they did because they believed it was the right thing. And they could have been wrong. I can't hold it against them. But I think that history must be clear on what their contribution was. And I find that today when people die. The minute they die, then people say nice things. Don't do that about me. If you have something horrible to say or that I've done, you know, put it out there. It's not truthful, I think, just simply to say we can't speak ill of the dead. It's a sort of traditional thing.
The nuns wouldn't have
and our history in that way is obscured. Because And staying with the politics now, that something that intrigued me was the fact that you mention a couple of times in your book that SWAPO, that is the representatives like Hitipo Hamotenya, who you just mentioned, offered you various positions and jobs. How do you evaluate these offers in hindsight as genuine offers because they saw you like that, or was it something to shut you up? Well, again, a good question, because the only reason I put that in my book was really, I mean, shortly after independence, when the Namibian began to sort of bang heads with SWAPO, and SWAPO claimed that the newspaper was basically turning their backs on the liberation movement, that it had supported up to independence and turned their backs on SWAPO and were anti-government and anti-SWAPO, which wasn't strictly true. I mean, we decided whatever happens post-independence, we will remain true to our goal of independent reporting, and that means speaking truth to power no matter who's in power. And that happened to be SWAPO, and so we thought we're going to speak the truth to them too. And obviously that wasn't to the liking of many in the liberation movement turned political party, because they thought the Namibian would continue simply to support them. Whereas prior to independence, our paths coincided to a large degree, mainly because we were advocating for Resolution 435 and the Independence Plan, and they did too. So it was largely coincidental rather than deliberate in a certain sense. But as I say, after independence, they claimed we were turning our backs on them, which was not the case in reality. But that perception was there. And so, as I say, we continued to stay true to those ideals of speaking truth to power as we went along.
Just realized, you were talking about NPP 435.
Yes.
And you never mentioned me. I was the only woman on that
committee.
Oh, really?
I'm so sorry, Marianne. I'm so sorry. But again, you know, I would go into a lot of detail on a lot of those names. And again, Rian would say to me, but what does all these names mean to if someone is sitting in Paris and reading your book? So I had to also try and think how people are. But I wanted to give people their little, you know, time in the sun. Sort of, exactly. But congratulations.
Thank you.
I'll put it in the follow-up.
In the edited version.
Exactly.
Okay. I spoke to a colleague recently about the students that we have coming from Namibia, but also from Germany, and students displaying a culture of entitlement. And in your book you also say, rewarding those who had supported the struggle became another priority. I opposed this from the onset and spoke out against what I termed a rapidly emerging culture of entitlement. And my question now is, do you think that this is relevant only here in Namibia, where people now that they have found sort of like a home, a sense of belonging, whereas before they were disadvantaged, they had no place really where they could be, that it refers to them only, or do you think that is a generation sort of like, yeah?
I think, you know, it's a bit of both. From your first question, asking about the positions that were offered to me, I mean, that was one of the reasons I turned them down. And at the time, a lot of people, when we were critical of SWAPO, would say, Gwen is just critical because she's bitter because SWAPO didn't give her anything as a result of her commitment to the struggle. Well, they did offer me things, but I didn't say that at the time. It wasn't the place or the time to do it. And so I thought the book was the right place to say that it was immediately after independence that I was offered the post of Minister of Information and Broadcasting, and Hidipo, who came to me with the offer on being asked by Cabinet to do so, I still laughed because I knew Hidipo quite well, and I said, I know Hidipo, you're trying to neutralize me, and I'm not buying it. And I said, I didn't do what I did for any kind of reward at the end of the day. I did it because I believed in what I was doing. And that applies still today. And I mean, even there are prominent figures today who still say, Gwen, you're a veteran, you're entitled to your farm and your 200,000, and I say, I won't take it. No, really. And I mean, much as though I would love nothing more than to have a little piece of land where I could sit at a water hole and watch the kudu come down to drink and write more books. I won't ever have that. I don't have a farm, and I won't take it under those reasons. I'm not a farmer, and this is one of the things I try to say to people today. You know, for me, employment is the big challenge in Namibia today, and I think the more people are employed, the less likely everybody would think a piece of land is going to do it all for you. It's not. And especially if you don't know what you're doing. I mean, put me on a farm and I'll give the cows names and the goats names, and I won't take them to market. And, you know, it's going to be a dead horse. Exactly, absolutely. So it just doesn't work that way, and I think many people are like that. We all good at something, and we need to find out what that something is and be good at it. And yeah, much as though, as I say, I'm tempted to have a little piece of land somewhere, I haven't got it, and so I have to borrow that space when I go out and visit and see other parts of our country. But back to entitlement, I think as far as that, the age of my era are concerned, a lot of those leaders, yes, that entitlement is still very strong, and I think this is one of the things the youth are sort of rising up against, is to say, look, your time is done. You've had what you needed to take as a result of your so-called struggle credentials, and now it's our time. And yes, there is that feeling among the youth that, and I mean, they say it in so many words, it's our turn to eat. And you know, it's difficult to say to them, look guys, sometimes it's better just to have to work your way up and do the things we did back in the old days, but it's not the old days anymore, and the youth are different. And that probably speaks not only to the youth in Namibia, but also to youth around the world, and especially coming from disadvantaged communities. So it's far harder to combat that feeling of entitlement, especially when they see others still have, who always had. And it's difficult. And I wish if people were more generous-spirited, especially the haves, which you don't see happening, then that wouldn't happen quite as much. So I think if people were more giving, and I know a couple of farmers who've really done great things, white farmers who've shared their land with their workers and things like that, but it's not happening on a bigger scale. And so the point is, the youth are getting impatient all over the world. These are tough times, made worse by the COVID era, and we're going to have to deal with those issues on the part of the youth, and they're not going to possibly choose the way of the pen, as I did, to try and change things in the future. We need to accept that.
Talking about the little piece of land that you want and writing, I know that the writing that will take place then will be different writing, because I found it so interesting when I got to the end of the book. I all of a sudden thought, wow, what has happened? Here is a totally different author who writes this part. It's so lyrical, and would you care reading
Just
us
to
a
read
part?
a bit.
Any
Cool.
part that you
Maybe I
want?
must explain first why that is. And I was
Yes,
telling
yes.
Amy earlier, is because I'm a more is more person when it comes to writing. One of my greatest challenges as a journalist was to write short sentences. And writing this book, I think exactly the same. I thought, right now, as someone who did write a lot of poetry, I love words and I love lyrical language and so on. And then when Rian came to edit the book, he kept saying to me, Gwen, less is more, less is more. And he was chopping all my beautiful words out. And I was saying, no, Rian, please don't do that. And I mean, I think the last 2 chapters of the book, where you do get a mention, Amy, so you're going to have to read the whole damn book. And not just pick and choose, is when I said to him, no, you're not going to touch that, because that is weaving the whole thing together with me putting my philosophy and my life story together. So I managed to keep a little bit of that.
Great, yeah.
Okay, so you must just tell me, I don't know, people. Basically, the chapter 66, and it starts A Life in Journalism. And it's, I think, is it the last chapter?
Yeah.
It is. In November 1990, 8 months after independence, the Namibian author Amy Skuman wrote an article about me in Flamingo magazine, asking, is Gwen Lister really in from the cold? Her telephone was once bugged, her staff besieged, and her offices vandalized, but she is now a respected citizen of Namibia. Unquote. While I appreciated the sentiment, I thought at the time this optimistic assessment might be premature, and so it proved to be. As I write these closing passages, on the veranda of a home in the Namib Desert near Sossusvlei, I realize that I've never really come in from the cold. My chosen path of independent thought and action never earned me any popularity, especially among the ruling elite. But while the SWAPO government might have remained equivocal about my role, this is not a bad thing, in the sense that ethical and honest journalists are always outsiders when they do their jobs as they should. I look back on a life lived to the full. If I have one regret, it's that I should have escaped more often to this vast expanse where the ochre plains stretch out almost endlessly, merging with distant peaks in hues of deep blue, purple, and shades of grey. Also, I sometimes wished I had a simple dwelling in the countryside. After independence, the government offered me what were known as veterans' benefits, a farm and a cash payout of 200,000, which I immediately declined. Take the farm, Elia George Kayama, a senior SWAPO politician, continued to urge me in ensuing years. President Hage Geingob also tried to convince me, saying that for all our differences, SWAPO still regarded me as a veteran of the struggle, and I was entitled to the rewards, but I stuck to my guns. I was highly critical of the culture of entitlement that had taken root post-independence. Besides that, if I was given a farm, I wouldn't have known what to do with it. You could have been an honourable, a friend joked upon learning that I'd also been offered a ministerial post decades previously, but a life in government was not for me. Sans farm, I will simply have to make do with my stock of memories. Namibia is a place of extremes. Classified as a semi-arid country, rainfall is erratic at best, and its people have learned to withstand long periods of drought, as well as man-made adversity. I've always hated driving northwards in a time of drought. It's sad to see the skeletal bush pigs rooting in the dry vegetation on the roadsides, and the vast landscape yellow and parched in the unrelenting sunlight. This is the time when Octoberitis sets in. People become irritable, tempers flare, and the suicide rate skyrockets. We hold our collective breath that the rains will come soon. When they do, the country bursts into colour overnight. The cleansed landscape, covered with a sea of yellow nesterkraut flowers, is spectacular at such times. There are no words to describe the fragrance of the desert after the flood and the sight of rivers coming out of nowhere. It fills me with an overwhelming love for this country, as well as gratitude that its thirst has been slaked. In the dry plains of the north, the Oshanas, bracket shallow pans, began to fill with the onset of the seasonal ifunja from Angola. The cattle are ankle deep in water, there are fish and frogs for local people to eat, and the big omayova flourish on the Antilles. How to describe my passion for this adopted country and its people? How it overwhelms me when I'm in red dune country in the south, or watching herds of game on the lush plains in the north. And how is this interlaced with my dream of a Namibia in which our people would nurture the land and prosper, never allowing themselves to take for granted the incredible privilege its beauty has bestowed upon us all. I think that's brilliant.
Thank you very, very much. So, you have fulfilled your dream. Are you at peace? I mean, you asked whether she is out of the cold. Now I ask whether she's at peace.
Haven't fulfilled my dream.
Not
And that's why I really continue to
great.
do what I'm doing.
Wonderful.
We all want Namibia to be the success story. It really promised it would once be. And I quote President Sam Nujoma, who, when I interviewed him in '83, said, I want Namibia to become the first success story in Africa. And I bought into that. And I thought, I want that too.
Okay, so
It's not happened yet, but we hope the youth will take us forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank
That's
you.
my part in this. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Apologies for not. My neck can't do that anymore as we get older. That 360.
Yeah. Are there any questions, any comments from the audience?
I'd like to just say something that to have your personal perspective and observations, ideas, thoughts made this so interesting.
Okay.
And I think for the young people, it's not just a history book. After all, it's history, but it's history.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Good point.
and I think that's important. You know, if I think if the personal part was removed, I don't know if it would be as you know, as gripping. I mean, I couldn't put it down.
Oh, great,
you know,
Jeannie. Thank
and
you.
so I think leaving the personal in, have a sequel or something.
Yeah, no, I just...
But really, it's. I think that's what made the book, and I think particularly for younger people, it would be more interesting, you know, for them to see. Well, this is what's happened. This
Right.
is what didn't happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you.
I think it goes a bit further than just seeing, because it's a matter of choice. And I think young people today are very often not given valuable choices anymore. They're just either channeled in this meaningless life of consumerism and so-called success of driving the bigger car than the neighbor, blah, this nonsense. Reading such books, I find, for young people gives them an understanding that they too can make relevant or irrelevant choices.
Right.
And I think that's also, that's also your personal quality. Everybody else told you through your life many times, why do you all do this?
Yeah.
You know, you could have had a probably more comfortable life and find a
Right.
rich husband or become a minister or whatever, something
Right.
like this, and you always chose not to.
Right.
And I think that is the quality of the book and the life behind it.
Thank
And
you.
that's what other people
Thank
can
you,
learn
Harold.
from it.
Yeah. And I agree. If nothing else, I do hope, and there is a paragraph a bit later where I say, I do hope that young people everywhere, because it was a tough struggle to do what I did, and it's not always easy, but if you have a dream, and it may not be the kind of dream I had, it may be another dream, a simpler dream, pursue it at all costs. And sometimes it means sacrifice, and sometimes it means hardship, but it's so much worth where you get to in the end if you've done it by yourself. So I'm hoping it will inspire some young people who read the book, wherever they come from.
Yeah, you chose the path less traveled, and that made all the difference.
Yeah. Thanks, Harold.
Gwen, I just want to say one of my favorite parts is where they offer you the cash in a shopping bag. You remember?
Oh, okay.
You really need
Oh,
the money for the next step in the journey.
Yeah,
And I mean, it could have made it easier for you to,
yeah,
to
yeah,
do the next right step,
yeah,
but with the wrong method. or whatever.
exactly.
How
Yeah.
hard was it for you?
No, that wasn't hard at all, Elmarie,
Yeah.
because it was offered to me in Lusaka
Yeah.
by the president to start the paper, and it was cash in a carrier bag, and it had come from Kenneth Kaunda's special fund. But there was no ways, because whenever I arrived back in Namibia, I was generally intercepted and questioned by security police or something. And I thought, oh my God, can I imagine arriving back with a bag of cash and what the heck would happen to me as a result?
Yeah.
So it was an easy decision
Yeah.
to say,
No.
sorry, but I can't do this.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
I just want to, is the sanction still up against the Namibian?
No.
So they removed the sanctions?
Yeah, they did. In fact, it was 10 years. In 2011,
No.
President Pohamba lifted that ban.
Oh.
It was shortly before or shortly after I handed over to Tangeni.
Oh.
So no, not at the moment.
Any other comments? If not, then thank you very, very much, Gwen, for
Thank you all for coming
all
and
your-
listening.
Oh, sorry, before you
Yeah.
finish. I attended, we had an anniversary in the warehouse, I think, at some time. Wasn't it? And I was living outside Namibia, and as a member of the anti-apartheid movement, we had a political decision that we would not travel to South Africa or Namibia,
Right.
because we would put the people we meet into danger, because we were kind of,
Yeah.
nothing would happen to us, but we
Yeah.
would just travel home and then.
So
So the Namibian as a newspaper, as a source of information, was really extremely valuable.
right.
And SWAPO had a small little office in Bonn, and we were friends, you know. There was a big difference between ANC and SWAPO.
Definitely.
You know, ANC was like, who do you think you are? You know, and, we are doing this and we were like this. And SWAPO was like, we slept in each other's houses. You know, when I
Yes.
came to Bonn, Giri Mozilla Shombe was already, he knew he should make the bill.
Right.
And the Namibian was a treasure. It was really a treasure. Because for us, it was very difficult to distinguish now between genuine and non-genuine information.
Sure.
Where when we saw something, we didn't first look at the content, we said, where does it come from?
Right.
We said that.
Right.
You know, but the Namibian was something we could just take and learn from. So that was really something special.
Thanks, Harold. Yeah. Great.
nice closing words, I would say. Thank you very much.
Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to our technical team there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anna and Rachel. We really appreciate your work. Okay, so you can, there's still some water and wine and everything if you want to mingle a little, you're welcome.
Thanks, Elmarie. Thanks. Thank you. Cool.
There's one question.
Oh no, come on now.